Hello guys, welcome back to video number 9. My name is Gavin and I'm from Gate English Training School. This is the final pre-chosen topic for the general English course. For the 10th video, as I've told you a few times before, I'm looking for you to suggest the topic and see what you would like me to talk about. And I'll take any suggestions that are popular amongst a lot of people but are also interesting topics. So today we are going to look at another common thing that we all talk about, and that is your hometown. As most of you might know by now, if you've been watching all of my videos, I'm from Sydney, the largest city in Australia, although not the capital of Australia. You see in the photo there, this is the skyline of Sydney. This is the Harbour Bridge. This is the Sydney Opera House. And this is Centre Point Tower, otherwise known as Sydney Tower. And this is the Sydney Harbour, the beautiful kind of like river mouth going into the country, where a lot of people go boating. So I probably shouldn't have to explain why this topic. It's such a common thing to talk about. When you meet a new person, one of the first things you'll say is, "Where are you from?" "I'm from Australia." "Really? Which city are you from?" "I'm from Sydney." And usually what happens is, "Oh, my cousin lives in Sydney. I have a friend who lives in Sydney. My uncle's working in Sydney. My nephew's studying in Sydney." It's a big city. Everybody knows somebody that lives in Sydney, it seems, or Australia at least. And that's normal. That's what we do. You know, if I'm traveling and I meet somebody from China, I'm going, "Oh, where about? Which city?" "Oh, I've been there. It was really nice." You know, it starts a conversation. It's actually a very common way to start a conversation and really get things going. So if I meet somebody from a city that I've been to, then that gives us a starting point. I can talk about the restaurants and shops and places in that town. As usual, let's begin with some simple general conversations. This is the Sydney fireworks one year, and this is the view this is my photo. I'm pretty happy with that photo, taken from my phone at the time. And where we were sitting had a really beautiful view of the harbour. So let's just work through the simple questions and answers as usual. Where are you from? "Oh, I come from Sydney, Australia." Now, because I'm from a fairly large city, I might just say I'm from Sydney, or I just say I'm from Australia. And then if people ask, I'll say I'm from Sydney. Depending on where you're from, like most people is, first, I'm from Australia. Now, if you come from a small, like a lot of people from America that come from, say, LA, or people from Sydney in Australia, we might actually just straight away say, "Oh, I'm from Sydney," or "I'm from LA," rather than even saying the country. If you're from Beijing or Shanghai, like a really, 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 really big famous city, you might just say the name of the city, not even the country. Now, for a lot of people, they might say, "Where is your hometown?" "Oh, I come from..." Say I was from Newcastle, the city I'm studying in. "I come from Newcastle. It's a city in Australia just an hour north of Sydney," or sorry, 2 hours drive north of Sydney. Something like that. Say Weihai, we say, "Oh, I come from Weihai," which is in a city in Shandong province in the east of China. It's just across from South Korea. Now, you might give a little bit of information like that. Now, if you're from a really, really famous city, you don't need to necessarily describe where that is. "I come from Beijing." "Oh, okay, that's enough information." "I come from New York." That's enough information. We know where New York is. Well, I hope. What's your hometown like? You know, so somebody, say you're studying in Australia and you say, "Oh, I come from a really small town in the countryside." Like, "Really? What's your hometown like?" And you'll describe your hometown. Now, I'm not going to answer that question too much now because I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes when we get to the next slide. So what's your hometown like? Just remember, this is a common question. What's your mother like? What is your job like? A lot of people get confused by this question. It doesn't mean what does the person like, what do people in your hometown like. It means, can you describe it? So what's your hometown like? "Oh, it's very quiet and peaceful with a really nice, clean environment," if you come from a town like that. So if you said, what's Sydney like? Well, Sydney's a fast-growing city that has pretty bad transport, but it has some beautiful natural places to visit and spend your time going to on your days off. The air's a little bit dirty because it's a big city, but it's still cleaner than most cities in China. Stuff like this. Do you miss your hometown? So imagine you're talking to me in China, or I'm talking to you. Oh, do you miss your hometown? Yes, I do. I miss some things about my hometown. Of course, my family are there, so I miss my family. But a lot of other things I don't miss very much. Like in Australia, now I'm living in another city. I still have the beautiful environment, the clean air, lots of wonderful outdoor activities to do, but I don't have to worry about the traffic and spending a long time traveling from one place to another on a crowded train. But of course, most of us are going to say, yes, we miss our hometown. And maybe there's a specific food that you miss in your hometown. Now, we talked about food earlier, but actually, or 2 lessons ago, we talked about food. And one thing I didn't actually say is, what is Australian food like? What's food like in your hometown? The thing is, Australia is a young country in terms of the white people there. Of course, there have been Aboriginal people living there for over or almost 80,000 years, or about 80,000 years there have been people living in Australia. But in terms of modern diet, we don't really have a lot of Aboriginal cooking and food mixed into our diet, except to say the way that we barbecue. Maybe some of the barbecue methods might come from that. So we kind of have a cuisine that's mixed from all countries around the world. We eat a lot of British food, a lot of American food. We eat Chinese food. We eat Asian food. We eat Indian food, Italian food, French food. We eat a weird, strange mix. So I don't particularly miss the food in a specific food in Australia, because we have so many different foods from all over the world that most of those foods I can get something like it somewhere else. I don't really miss a lot of foods from my hometown. Like if I go to Beijing, I can get most of the kinds of foods that I could get in Sydney, and some of them in Weihai. What do you usually do for fun in your hometown? Now, like I said, I'm an outdoors person, so I like to go bushwalking. Now, in China, you would say hiking. You have a different kind of forest, different kind of mountains. You would call it hiking. In Australia, we call it bushwalking. In fact, yesterday I went bushwalking with an old friend. So just walking out in the trees in the natural environment. If the weather's nice, I love going to the water, swimming in the sea, going to the beach and spending a day in the water, or doing lots of different water sports. So things like that. I also love to watch my favorite sporting team, the rugby league team, the Canterbury Bulldogs, who I watch a lot when I'm living in Australia, and I even watch them online from China. So I'll go and watch sport, I'll play sport, and I'll spend a lot of time outdoors. So that's me. I'm a very active person. I don't like to sit at home and just watch movies all the time. I do watch movies, but not as much as maybe others. Would you like to live in your hometown in the future? Now, a lot of people say, no, I don't want to live in my hometown because it is too small and there are not many job opportunities. Now, if you live in a tiny, tiny, tiny village, I understand that. People from Weihai, there's 1 million people or more there. You've got plenty of opportunities. I say the opposite. I wouldn't like to live in Sydney in the future because I don't like big cities. I never want to go and live in Beijing again. I go there to visit friends, but I don't want to live in Beijing ever again. I like the fact that in Weihai, I can go from my home to my work to the beach all in like a few minutes walk. I love that about a small town or a small city, a town, not a city. So I don't really want to live in Sydney in the future. Maybe one day I will, depending on how my life goes, but I don't plan to live in Sydney in the future. So let's move on, and I'm going to talk now about my hometown. So first of all, as I've told you, I come from Sydney in Australia, which actually that blue dot is actually Newcastle, because I took a photo of that's just where I am right now. I took a screenshot. So Sydney's a tiny bit below that, about there. Now, within Sydney, there is a suburb called Hornsby. So suburbs is like the areas of the city. We break it up. And Sydney's probably got about 50 suburbs across the city, all the different areas of Sydney. Now, if we have a look at a map of Sydney, it's quite spread out. It's actually a very, very large city for 5 million people. And you'll see that there's a lot of green there, like a lot of national parks come into the city. So where I lived is somewhere around here somewhere. I'd say about there, maybe. I'm not too sure on this map. Okay, my best friend lived up here, and he's still part of Sydney. Technically, this area, Brooklyn, is still part of Sydney. Richmond is kind of getting out of the very, 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 very edge. Penrith down to Campbelltown. But in between that, there's lots of forests and national parks. The main part of Sydney is kind of here. But if you look at the size of Sydney compared to Beijing, Sydney takes up probably the same or even a little bit more area. But you see that there's a lot less green in Beijing, a lot more green in Sydney. And of course, Beijing, a city that size, has a lot more tall buildings. And so there's like, 4 or 5 times more people in that space. Now, when you look at Sydney, you see all that green, especially in the north, the south, and the mountains to the west. They're not big mountains, but they are there. So you see that Sydney is a very spread out country. Of course, it's a coastal city. And you can see here, this is the water of Sydney Harbour coming in. There's also lots of water there. And that's the other difference between Beijing. You have a small river, tiny lakes, but otherwise you don't have lots of water. Whereas we have this huge bit of water coming in here, and the city surrounds that water. There's also quite a few other lakes around there, and other inlets, another large area of water here. There's rivers coming in all through here. Lots of rivers coming through the north and southern areas of Sydney. Now that red marker there, that's the area where I grew up and spent the first 21, 22 years of my life in that area. So that's more than half my life at the moment. I've spent living here. That is Hornsby. So Hornsby is a suburb of Sydney. So let's have a look closer at that. So this is the suburb of Sydney. You have the train line coming up here to the train station. We don't say subway station because it's such a large city. It's actually mostly above ground, not below ground. This is the main shopping area in Hornsby around here. And these are all the houses where people live. Now, I showed you a picture of my house that I grew up in, which is down around this area on this street. So you can see, growing up in Hornsby, there's a lot of national park off to the west side of Hornsby. From my home, I could walk into this park in less than in 2 minutes, I could be in this park, walking down here and into the national park. There's a huge national park here. So I could walk down here into this area, a place called the Fish Ponds. We used to go there all the time. As a kid, I'd walk along here, down here, into the park. Now, as a kid, for me to go into, well, not as a kid, when I got older and I was going into university and working in the city, I still lived at home. I'd walk up here, along here, to the train station. That would take me 10 to 15 minutes to walk all that way. Then I would take a train for 50 minutes into the city. When I had my first job, and when I was at university, about 45 minutes. So every day I'm spending at least an hour going to uni every day to university to go into the city. That's kind of normal suburban life. Again, we go back and we look at that map of Sydney. People live all the way around the edge here and take trains, and most people work somewhere in the area here, the CBD, Central Business District. That's my hometown. I like growing up on the edge of Sydney, out right in the north of Sydney, where it's very green, lots of parks, lots of trees, people living in houses, not tall apartment buildings. So I thought you might be interested in knowing a little bit about what that area was like for me growing up. And let me just show you one last thing. This was the front of my house. I showed you a photo in behind those trees last time. We also have 2 rubbish bins. The red one is for regular rubbish and yellow is for recycling. And we put that out once a week to be collected. And this is a general look over the back of my suburb. Lots of trees. That's what Australia's like once you get out of the CBD. Trees everywhere. And that's probably the thing I like best about my hometown.